Reactive Training Systems.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast. I'm Coach Mike, and today I'm joined by Coach Mel, and we'll be talking to Coach Jason Tremblay from the Strength Guys. If you're familiar with powerlifting, the competitive powerlifting scene, powerlifting coaches, any of this at all, no doubt you'll at least know the name, the Strength Guys, and probably know Jason Tremblay specifically. He's been on the podcast a couple times already. Always really enjoyable to talk with him. We definitely have different approaches to training, but I find what he does to be very fascinating, and I think he would say the same thing. So it's always a very interesting conversation, and I'm always honestly thrilled to compare notes with Jason. He coaches a significant roster of really talented lifters, and let's be honest, it's always fun. If you're going to nerd out about training, it's fun to nerd out about that group in particular. And I think there's a lot to be learned there. And there's things that you can learn that apply to lifters at all different levels. Anyway, this is a really cool conversation. We go into specifics on training for Taylor Atwood, for Joe Jordan, and for Celine Crum. And honestly, we could have talked for another hour just about these athletes. And then, once you start looping in others and kind of broader topics and things like that, there's a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to just jump right into it. Jason will kind of cover a little bit of his own background before we get into some of the specifics. So I'll let him tell it better than I can. So without any further delay, here's our conversation with Coach Jason Tremblay from the Strength Guys. All right. Hey everyone, welcome back. Jason, it's good to see you again. Mel, thanks for being here. I think, Jason, we've done a few of these before, both podcasts for your channel, done a couple podcasts for my channel. It's been a little while though, so maybe by way of getting conversation going again and introducing you to people that might be newer on my channel, let's start off with a little bit of your background and just kind of, what do you see your role in powerlifting as? Like, how did you get into coaching powerlifting and things of that nature? Kind of what's the quick Jason Tremblay bio?
Well, thank you for having me on again, Mike. It's always a pleasure to see you at Meet, to do a podcast with you. You're one of the good guys in the community. And yeah, I enjoy our conversations. So from the time I was 16, I knew what I wanted to do in life. It was unwavering. I knew that I wanted to train athletes. At that time, I was into natural bodybuilding very heavily. And over the next 5 years or so, as I started going to school, I became more and more interested in periodization and strength training, started strength training myself. And while I was going to school, each day I was tweeting out my thoughts and impressions and what I was learning. And that grew a decent following within a year. And after about a year, people started asking me for online programming. And that was for bodybuilding, but it was also for powerlifting. And my response to people who inquired for powerlifting, I do want to be upfront that I've never competed in powerlifting. And quite often the response I would get is, I trust you and I trust your knowledge. I started coaching powerlifting before I had ever competed in it myself, which is completely backwards way of viewing it. But at least I was honest that I wasn't deceiving people about this. Competed in powerlifting about a year after that period. Honestly, I felt pretty dead inside competing, whereas coaching, I freaking love it. Like that brings the fire out of me. And so I took from this experience that coaching is what I want to do. Throughout the 2010s, I still didn't know whether I wanted to coach in professional sports or powerlifting, bodybuilding. So I did a series of strength and conditioning internships with Brett Bartholomew down in Los Angeles, Daniel Noble in Toronto, and then for 3 years with the Calgary Flames under Ryan Van Asten and Alan Selby. And these experiences, along with my lack of competitive experience, left a big impression on me because I haven't been in these settings before. I didn't play high-level hockey. I didn't play American football. So that kind of the locker room culture and way of doing things was very new to me. And I had my own utopian ideas about how things should run. And it was annoying to me when I saw things running in a way that was not the way that I think it should be. You know, a smoothly operated machine supporting, $100 million rosters. And so I kind of started expressing this side of me that's like a status quo challenger in these different areas. And that really
ruffles some feathers, I'm sure.
Yeah. Sometimes I ultimately got my answer that I loved coaching powerlifting above any other sport I've worked with. It's not even close. And so I've just tried to carry over those lessons I learned from. I started coaching powerlifting when I was 19. I'm 32 now, so I've been around for a while, but I started super young. And then all the strength and conditioning internships I've done, and all the people I've been fortunate to receive mentorship from and work with to form my own ideas and way of doing things, it's been a very fun, rewarding journey so far.
Yeah, man. I want to get into that some more. I know that there's a couple topics I hope we can get to that'll kind of loop in more of like things that you learned during your sports preparation, sports strength and conditioning career that you've been bringing into powerlifting more lately. I can see you doing that too. So I want to come back to that, but I guess turn our attention toward powerlifting and your catalog of work there. You've really worked with a lot of very impressive athletes, lately, just kind of off the top of my head. Taylor Atwood is probably the highest profile athlete that I'm aware of, although Leah Pavois is probably right up there, depending on how you're ranking these sorts of things. Joe Jordan, Jessica Espinal, Celine Crum. You are definitely working with a lot of talented lifters. They're your lifters and not your children, so you can pick favorites. Do you have a favorite?
I'm gonna plead the fifth on that one, Mike.
Well, who's your least favorite? Who's the biggest pain? Can you tell us that? I'm sure that's way less.
I had the same answer, but then I can give you some more.
Or even, what's the profile of the athlete that exemplifies the traits that you are really compatible with in success? And likely, if you look at the athletes, successful athletes probably all have these traits in common, but
I think you can view coaching as a coach-centered relationship, which I think is dictatorial and old-fashioned and not best in the current age. You could view it as an athlete-centric relationship, which I think in some regard it's much better than coach-centric, but I think that's fake in a way. Or you could view it as a coach-athlete-centric relationship. We're a team. And when I'm working with someone, I want to feel like we're functioning as a high-performing team. So the price of admission is you pay my rate to hire me for my services, but I'm not this greedy person who's sitting here just raking in the dough and sending out a shitty, you know, the 10th version of an Excel program to a different client each day. You know, I put a lot of thought, emotional investment, and to improve and solve people's problems into each client. And so there are expectations that we're on the same page, that we're accountable, but I think accountability is not only about the bad, the things that people could do better. It's also about the good things that people did well. And I find it very grating to work with someone who accountability is only about what's bad, and it's a one-way street. It needs to be mutual accountability. Both parties hold each other accountable, and it needs to be for good and bad. Otherwise, it just gets toxic and like, man, like this is not a fun consult to be in. I want things to be collaborative. I want people to feel heard. But then there's also a point in time where we're going to follow my lead. And maybe there are some niche situations where we're going to follow the athlete's lead. So the leadership dynamics need to be functional and fluid and natural. I expect that if something isn't going well, that we're going to address that rather than just do nothing and hope to get a better result. And I expect consistency. Like, I'm going to be consistent getting your program out with the level of thought and effort that I'm putting into developing as a coach and solving your problems. I want you to be consistent with updating me with your effort and training, with filling out your training logs, sending in your videos, etc. And I think these things, and above all else, effective communication, are the foundation of consultations that both the coach and an athlete will enjoy. So that's what I look for when I'm working with someone.
The infamous non-logging athletes. I'm sure that you've had some of those as well. That's what comes to mind for me. Talking about like people who, like athletes needing to put in the effort as well, not just like with training and things like that, but also on the administrative side. Because like you've got to get feedback, you know, so you can do your job fully. Anyway, my intention wasn't really to lead us too much down the athlete trash talking road. Because honestly, there's usually not too much to say there. If you don't get along with athletes, they tend to find somewhere else to go, and that's probably for the best for everyone. I guess kind of bring it back a little bit. You have been, I suppose, putting words in your mouth a little bit. You know, you've been fortunate to work with some really talented athletes, and you've done a really good job of, you know, doing your part as a coach in those relationships. And probably the one that you guys are best known for working with is Taylor Atwood, who recently had a pretty stellar comeback performance. Just to catch us all up, he totaled 830 in the 83 class, 10 times body weight total. And I mean, everybody that watches the videos from that competition knows that there was a lot more in the tank. I'm sure you have a sense of exactly how much more there was in the tank. Is that something that you want to talk about or share, or is that something that you guys hold close to the chest? Hey, let me tell you something that I know about you. Your lifting is important to you. It's probably one of your biggest priorities. And for people like us, nothing compares to the feeling that you get when you set a new PR. That feeling of being the best that you've ever been, of doing something that you've never done before. This is what we're all after, and it's also what RTS specializes in. Getting you the absolute best program possible so that you can hit new PRs and reach your goals. We call it radically individualized training, and we're really good at it. Whether we need to account for busy schedules or equipment limitations, or precisely turn the dials and get the details of the program just right, we have the tools and the experience to guide your lifting to the next level. To us, coaching is all about leadership, relationship, and creative problem solving. A coach should be poised to help you make tough decisions about training and competing so that you can continually grow in your development. And of course, a coach should be a first-rate problem solver, especially when it comes to your training, technique, and strategy. Now, all this has to be built off of a really strong, professional coaching relationship that emphasizes trust and respect. Additionally, RTS coaches are not on an island. We have a strong network of professionals to reach out to, so if you find yourself in need of some specific expertise, say in the realm of nutrition or injury management or sports psychology, there's a deep expertise available there too. For more information, go to store.reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on coaching. That's store.reactivetrainingsystems.com, then click on coaching. Hope to see you on the team soon.
I think if we were to push the absolute limit that day, it was kind of a fantasy scenario because the risk of that backfiring on us, given the stage and his return to sport from chronic injury, was just way too high. But I think he would be somewhere around 850 on that day if we had to push him. It just wasn't the goal, it wasn't the situation, and so it was never something that we really entertained either.
Yeah, that's smart. That's smart coaching and competing, but it's always something that powerlifters do is they look and see like what could have been there, given perfect circumstances.
Right? You do the third attempt, and it's like, what could I have done if I had one more? And the sport just doesn't actually work that way.
But what that does for training afterwards, when an athlete leaves a meet, knowing they had more in the tank, training afterwards, so fired, so invested, and especially coming back from an injury, that is a good win to have on the athlete.
You go in, you do what you need to do, and then you're healthy, and you have growing confidence, and you also don't have this big deficit of physical and mental recovery from putting yourself through the wall to bounce back from and get on with training.
Yeah, you could definitely see, for him that it was good to be back and, having kind of been there myself a little bit, little different circumstances, but I was really glad to see that for him. What was the thought process that led you guys to move up to 83? I'm sure this has been something that, the powerlifting internet has thrown around for a long time. What about you guys? Has this been a long time in the making, or was this just the moment?
Taylor was a 74 for over a decade. He was still building muscle within the class and getting aggressively bigger, even though his upper body, you wouldn't say is the biggest of a 74 kilo competitor. His legs have always been just ginormous. And when he became a dad and the sleep deprivation started kicking in, and he started to get an ache here, and then compensation ache somewhere else, and then an ache back in the original area, and then an ache in a new area. And for 2 years, he went from being at the level that he was when he was at his peak to injury here, injury here, injury here, injury here. And like the injury is just pinballing around his body. And meanwhile, we're trying to adhere to the competitive schedule. We have to compete at Sheffield, we have to compete at Worlds, we have to compete at Nationals. And so we're not taking time away from high intensity training. We're actually trying to do high intensity training to get ready for high pressure competitions while dealing with a storm of incidents that are just coming in, one after the other, and they're all related. I believe that we didn't have time. And after we lost World, things had just spiraled so far out of control to the point where, Taylor Atwood is not a 777, 74 lifter. He's much stronger than that. And we had nothing to prepare for. So our first thing was we need to take a full break from main lift training for 4 weeks. We just did single leg work, dumbbell work, let his body heal. It's something that we had never done for that amount of time and ever.
How do you take the conversation?
At that point, he was welcoming of it. It was hard for him not to do the main lifts, but I think everyone was looking for a way to stop the downward spiral. And
Yeah, and at the point where he's been dealing with pain for that long as well, I would imagine that, lays the groundwork to have that discussion to begin with.
yeah, I think it did challenge his identity as it relates to training, because that's what he knew, and he had to do so much unfamiliar stuff. But it wasn't a hard conversation to have with him that this was the logical way forward where we were. And then he was commentating at Sheffield, so we're all there last year, and we agreed to have a team meeting on Sunday. And so Kedrick, Ben, Scott, and I had like a 3-hour team meeting where we talked about how things got this way. Different parties got emotional. Different parties got angry with one another. We left being on the same page, though, and we left with clear decisions of what we were going to do differently moving forward. And one of those decisions was, let's pretend that Austin and Russell do not exist. What is best for Taylor Atwood right now? And we felt that going up a weight class would reduce how hard he'd have to train to continue competing at the top level as 74, which it would be easier on his joints and tendons, and it would be less restrictive in his everyday life. Instead of having to, eat 2,100 calories in perpetuity, to stay a 74 kilo lifter, he could go out and have a burger with his family some nights. And so that was the main reason why we decided to go up.
That's interesting. I think for a lot of coaches, you imagine these scenarios, right? And like the scenario where you've like completely maxed out your weight class and it's time to move up. It can look different in different circumstances. We'll touch on a couple of them today, actually. But it's interesting that this particular set of circumstances looks like, getting beat up, accumulating some injuries at a given weight class. And you're thinking the way to solve this is to, reduce training volume. But how do you do that and also still have an expectation of progress? Well, if you are a little less restricted with calories and, we're moving up a weight class, then that's sensible. I think kind of the doctrinal scenario that bounces around a lot of people's minds would be something like, you're just maximally shredded in a given weight class, and, you've maximized your efficiency and you're just not getting any stronger. Well, you need to add muscle. I mean, I guess that can happen, but that's probably the least frequent way that it happens.
Yeah. Not a father yet. I very much look forward to that. But what I've seen as my client population has gotten older too is like, yeah, that's a very idealistic way of looking at it, that you should be peeled and just like, look like Ronnie Coleman next to all your competitors in your class because you're so jacked. But actually, it's like, what about when they didn't sleep more than 5 hours and they have, 2-hour workout coming up, and then their kid brings home a bug from daycare or something like that. And it's just like recovery is terrible right now. And so is there anything that we could do to improve recovery and quality of life? And reducing the amount of restraint. Because if you're under the gun doing an hour of rehab, doing hard training sessions, being there for your work, being there for your family, having to weigh out every morsel of food, it's not a super enjoyable existence for a long period of time. And so it was about intervening in that area. And yeah.
It's interesting because you talk about the programming being built for the athlete, but those who are really competitive, their lifestyle is influences their ability to be an athlete and meeting them where their life is at that moment as it changes too.
It does. Working with Taylor has been really interesting because I've coached him for 11 years now. So it's changed. It's changed over that time, and it kind of, life has its fluctuations. And so we just had to make a decision based on what was best for us then.
So when you guys decided to move up a weight class, how long did you give for that move to happen?
So we decided at Sheffield last year,
Okay.
and we
So what's that, it's
excitedly went
been
and got
6 or
pizza
8
right
months or
after.
so?
I
It
guess
was a
the process
celebratory pizza.
right away.
Yeah.
And just lessening the amount of specific training that he needed to do didn't put an end to our compensation effects of injuries that were happening. And I think it's important to really zoom out in the perspective of an injury. Like, let's say that you hurt your right shoulder. Well, then you want to consider, how is hurting my right shoulder going to affect the amount of bar tilt and rotation I have in my squat? It might not, but it might. And that could actually affect your legs, your hips, your back, like all the way down the chain. The other shoulder, especially on bench press. Okay, so like I can't flare my right shoulder out as much as I used to because that position hurts. So now you become more of a close grip bencher on one side, more elbows tucked. Well, are you going to start shifting more of the loading demands onto your left side because that hasn't been injured yet? And if you are, is your left side strong enough and resilient enough to take on that amount of force that is about to be added onto it without making further changes in your program? And then if you are compensating towards the opposite side, are you doing what you need to do on the injured side to restore the capacity of that and then take it to a new level? There's a lot of things that happen. We only think about like my right shoulder hurts, I need to make my right shoulder better. But actually an injury affects the entire system
Because your
oftentimes.
system's going to compensate. It wants to protect itself.
Right, including the mindset, of course. And Taylor, it was like back injury, groin injury, other groin injury, back to the back injury, and then knee injury.
Which further solidifies what you were saying, that those compensation methods were popping up and they were ineffective on adding more weight to the bar.
Yeah.
And eventually you have to call it.
Right. And then the final one was the proximal hamstring injury. And so it's like, all right, he can't squat into his knees because he has a serious quadriceps tendinopathy. He can't sit back into his hips because he has a proximal hamstring tendinopathy. He can't widen his stance out because his groin was recently hurt. We're still rehabbing that. So what are your movement options available to you right now? Oh, and we're like 6 weeks out from Worlds, and now he's finally got some competition, And it was just like a nightmare situation to be in. And when Taylor started eating up after Sheffield, it was this idea of, okay, like Taylor might not be able to lift X amount of weight, but without compensating into his hamstring and ticking that off, or taking into his quad and taking that off. So let's just try really light with a weight that he's not compensating with.
That's within the capacity of all the joints without any strain and redistribution.
So we're building that up over a long period of time, and had another hamstring setback. So it's like, all right, well, a specific strategy, even though we had like 12 weeks of healthy training, still didn't do it. So now we need to start implementing more targeted exercise prescriptions for the various issues that he's had. It's now been like 2 years of dealing with injuries in different parts of the body. So the amount of disuse that he had of different muscles. So we're prescribing a lot of very local isolation movements to improve the endurance, improve the muscle mass, and improve the strength in different stabilizer muscles, primary movers, synergist muscles, and just trying to like get that foundation of muscle mass back that he had. And when we really started to make traction back to 830 Taylor that recently competed, I'd say it was around April or May of last year when I brought Patrick Carr from our team onto Taylor's collaborative coaching team. Patrick's a strength and conditioning coach of over a decade, and also a powerlifting coach. And so we realized we had barely any movement options to help Taylor like train his quads. We were basically resorted to doing Spanish squat isometrics and reverse leg drags. So like a terminal knee extension. And we were blasting those, and those felt great. And then we were able to start doing tempo belt squats, where he really was careful with how he was sitting down, because his hamstring's still tender too. And we're squatting once per week, very few reps of actual low bar back squat. And just over the course of many months, we're progressing exercises like step ups too, and just kind of leg extensions. We're just gradually adding in these movements to help restore range of motion by progressing the joint angle phase by phase.
So you used a lot of variation in the accessories in order to load the quadriceps up slowly. You're not just picking with the winner exercise and keeping with that, but rather a few different options.
Right. Because what was determining the main lift volume, intensity, and frequency during this time of injury was the amount of time it took for regeneration of the injured areas to occur. Taylor his muscles were recovered in like 48 hours, good to go again, good to squat 3 times a week, he'd say, but his tendons were only tolerating 1 time per week, and then we need to ease off and really go about our exercise prescription in a careful way to not tick this issue off further. And so we gradually added back in more main lift training, got him back up to 3 times per week squatting for 8 weeks before this competition. But it was done in a very different way than how he was training when he was at his previous peak in 2021.
I want to get more into that, so let me just put a pin in that for a second. What was the main indicator for you guys that, basically whatever your current level had been completed and you were well prepared to move up to the next level of difficulty? You had, you've been using a specific set of variations or a specific amount of training, and you had done what you could do at that point, and you were ready to move up to the next level. Is it, like you mentioned, his muscles will recover rather quickly? Are you just mostly monitoring like joint connective tissue discomfort, or is there something else that you're paying attention to?
Step ups a test and an accessory for us in our programming, because we started off concentric only body weight on a low box. And once you can do that, progress the range of motion. And by progressing the range of motion, we're increasing knee and hip flexion. So we're starting to get into similar joint angles as the box height gets higher to what he was doing in the squat. And if you could do that concentric only, and then you really just like step down in the easiest possible way without controlling it, can you control the eccentric? Because movement control is even more foundational than having work capacity and muscle mass and strength. So if you can't control a movement, you really don't have much at all.
So you're really looking for control and conscious pace, and if
Yep.
he is like in pain, or is it just the smoothness of the movement and how confident and strong it feels?
Yeah, and because we were dealing with tendon injuries, we expected low levels of discomfort, but that discomfort could not increase during, after, or within the following days after. And we were very careful about how much training we were doing, almost overestimating the recovery time after a training session at the start. And so once we restored movement control, we start to adjust now we're adding in temple bell squat, something like that, because along the same lines with movement control, if you can't control a weight doing the movement slow and with low load, how are you going to control it doing it fast and with heavy load, right? So it's this idea of let's start slow and light and listen to his feedback about how he's feeling pain in the area, how his recovery feels in the days that follow, and also his eagerness and confidence to squat, because there was a lot of fear. If I go down this way, my knee's going to hurt like heck, or even that my quad's going to tear because his quad tendinopathy was pretty bad. Or if I sit back into it, now my hamstring's going to hurt like heck, and kind of when he felt ready, we would progress things. And the final step, as we started doing more and more specific lifting, I brought Urban Muir into our collaborative coaching team. And Urban is a very experienced powerlifter and powerlifting coach. He's the president of Powerlifting Slovenia, but he's also a scientist. He has his PhD in physics, and he teaches at Oxford in England. He views the training process.
Hold on a second.
Yeah, can we linger on how great that is?
You're
I'm a
overpowered
professor.
on the mental horsepower required for powerlifting coaching at that point.
He's a smart guy. And we were riding up Taylor's Peak for the October Scary Strong meet. And he said we had 2 days per week squat in there because that's what we were having success with so far. And Urban said, how are we going to know on this day where you have some top sets and then some volume work, what causes the issue if there is a setback? And then we agreed it would be better to have very, very, very small amounts of intensity. Like it started with 1 rep on one day at 80%. And then it became 3 sets of 1 with 80%. We increased from rep. And then you have your repetition practice days with less load. And we were doing high bar squat to continue to rebuild his quadriceps and also his trust in his ability to load his knees again. And so we separated it out. Each day had a very specific purpose. And we didn't end up having another issue relating to his lower body on squat. But if we did, it would have been easy to say like, that's what ticked it off. And then we could have problem solved better from that.
It makes sense to, like, in the sense that you guys are developing work capacity, that strategy where you've got more frequent workouts that are each smaller in volume, it's just easier to tolerate. It causes less of a disruption. Even when things are going well, you just get less overall soreness. You get less of just like a disruption to your physical state.
Yes. And Taylor was a 3 time per week squatter when he was at his best levels. So I think as time has gone on, even after the meet, we've been able to continue progressing that. And it's been very fruitful so far. Yeah, that's a little bit on how we came back from all this. So it was a lot more strength and conditioning emphasis, very different from how we were training him before. But I think his ceiling now is, I don't think he ever was the best he could have been at 74. I think the political drama, because he didn't get to go to Worlds that year. And then we didn't compete at the Virginia Pro because we didn't know if that was going to get us suspended from Powerlifting America. Never got to see his best meet yet. And like Taylor's, his talent is really, really incredible. Like another use of variations that we had to do as he was coming back was he was getting so strong so fast that we had to give him variations just to limit the amount of weight that he would put on the bar, because otherwise it was going to start leading to another setback. Yeah, it was just
You had to make things harder for him.
Yeah, hold the horses back. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So you guys built a lot of capacity, including more variations and things of that nature. It developed muscles in different ways that allowed you to kind of regain movement capacity that may have been lost over those years. Is that something that you guys are going to continue doing in any capacity? Do you continue to have an eye toward that?
So I think movement is dynamic throughout an athlete's career. And the biggest thing that can change a movement strategy is an injury, right? That's like a traumatic event that's going to affect how you move moving forward. What I've taken from this, it's many things, but on this topic, we want to make sure that the main lift training that we're doing is reinforcing a pattern that we want to reinforce and not a dysfunctional pattern that's leading to further injury. Because with a high specificity training approach, you're reinforcing a pattern over and over again. And when you do that, you reinforce the skill of doing that pattern, but you can also reinforce the errors that the person does that pattern with. And you could also reinforce and continuously add more inflammation onto areas which can potentially chronically weaken over time. So if someone is following a highly specific training strategy, we want to make sure that, for example, if you're doing low bar squat, where you're loading your hips more, this would be a really good match. Someone who maybe needs to strengthen their hip extensors more because their quads are, overwhelmingly strong. But it's not going to be the way to help a lifter with lagging quads improve their strength, because you're not really loading it that much, right? You're just reinforcing this, let's use your hip and back extension more and more over time. And yeah, I view the movement almost like we have to clear you for specific training now, rather than we're just going to administer it right off the bat.
Yeah. Does that look like additional, like you're being mindful of stuff like that when you're doing technical reviews, or is there some other indicator that you're pulling in?
Technique reviews at different load. I'm watching how your movement changes with fatigue, with increasing load. If we do notice a movement change in your update, and perhaps we went up 5 kilos, is this movement change an act of randomness, which would indicate that we need to deal with something, technique consistency, or is it a compensation due to load? And if it is a compensation to load, it's looking deeper to see what is actually happening, considering the athlete's injury history, and trying to understand what's going on beneath the surface, and then train what we need to train in that, rather than just saying like, we're going to low bar squat this person as much as they can, because that strategy can be and is effective, but it lacks precision, and it's also not a sustainable way of training throughout the entire career.
Yeah, I mean, it works until it doesn't. If you kind of think of it, my brother got into racing remote control cars. Maybe not racing, but he was playing around with remote control cars, designing his own and things like that. And to find out that, you would engineer it in specific ways so that, when you crashed, certain parts would break first, and they were the parts that were the easiest to repair, and things like that. And it got me thinking about, like, from an athletic standpoint, you're going to push your body as far as you can, and then something is going to be a limiter, and then you have to then deal with that. And certain people, those limiters don't seem to show up until really far down the road. And then other people have to deal with limiters almost immediately, just because the differences in how we're all built, what we can tolerate, differences in work capacity. Could go on and on about that, but I guess those constraints really seem, at least to me, seem to lead us down the path of like different programming solutions.
Yeah, the goal of training is to apply enough stress to provoke an adaptation. And then within that, it's also not to overdo it on the amount of stress that you apply to the point where you trigger an injury or on a decline in performance that you don't want. Yeah, I think this process of helping Taylor through this complex string of injuries has opened my eyes to individualizing training in the way that you've said. And it's almost brought me closer back to what we were doing in strength and conditioning with, you have team plays 82 games of hockey. Maybe they make playoffs, and then they have another extra like 7, 14, 21 games, depending on how far they make it. And afterwards, they would take 3 weeks off completely. No hockey, maybe yoga or like very light training. And then we start with a very easy period of training to build work capacity and mobility and stability. And they wouldn't start skating until 1 month before training camp quite often. It's kind of like now when someone competes, unless they're in like their prime years, quite often an advocate of let's not compete 3 times this year. Let's compete twice, and let's take some time to regenerate and to improve some of the general qualities that we haven't been able to address, because the way that I peak someone is still pretty similar to how I've always worked. But let's take some time to focus on a variation of qualities that we worked. And then let's get you ready for that specific training approach that we know works and apply it to be at our best when it matters most. But yeah, just a lot more targeted now.
Yeah. It sounds like, for what it's worth, like I see that in the stuff that I see coming from you. I see this sort of mindset shift a little bit over the years, but it makes sense to me too that you would kind of have that preparation period in mind, and that you would be looping in more lessons learned from, your time in strength and conditioning. At the end of the day, like, you're still looking at an athlete and trying to cause a certain set of adaptations. It's not like the adaptations are a little different. They build in a different way, and there's differences to be sure, but still, like, it's an adaptive process that's shares a lot of similarities.
And it keeps the goal, having a
Yeah.
bit of a long-term plan of these are the things we need to do to check off the boxes in order to get to the work that will peak you for high performance.
Really interesting to think about like competing twice a year as a mechanism for doing that. It makes sense. I suppose when I haven't really thought about it much in that term, but when I think about it at this particular moment, that's got to be a tough pill to swallow for some athletes because some like 3 times a year doesn't feel like that much, but when you look at the peaking process that's required, it chews up a lot of the calendar, you know. So it makes sense to, if you reduce your frequency of competition, you do avail yourself of more resources for that off season. Have you considered like trying to work it in more in the spaces between training phases and things like that, just as more of a like a means to maintain those abilities? Or is that something that you buy into?
Generally, build a new microcycle at the start of a non-competitive period. I might update the microcycle more often in the non-competitive period because we're working on a larger variety of qualities. And it's really not until like 4 to 8 weeks out where we're really tapering that down by a substantial amount and ramping up the specific volume and intensity. So I think I end up designing a new microcycle less and less as competition approaches. And I'm just gradually taking things out or maybe progressing certain exercises that I want to progress. And I think that ends up maintaining what we want to maintain. And then if it does decay in the final 4 to 8 weeks, we can boost the amount of training that we're doing for it again after the competition. So I guess a more gradual and extended approach is my way of applying the pivot concept.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for that. That's a idea that I heard guys talking about coming up, like taking more extended off seasons. Like Dave Tate talks about, taking a period after training. I think he says something like 8 weeks or something like that, where after a competition, he tries to keep people from putting a bar on their back or in their hands, a straight bar for like 8 weeks, which still feels like a lot to me at this point in my life. But, I do have to say, like, my views on this have definitely changed over the years. I used to be like, well, just competed, I'm back in the gym on Monday, and I would push most people to do the same. But as time has gone on, it's not necessary. And it seems to be like not harmful when you're in this certain period of your life. But then anytime outside of that, it's not good. May as well get in the habit of taking a little time away, I think.
I think as competitive experience accrues through the years, it's wise to take more time to regenerate and more time to prepare. I think that's a logical approach to reduce the amount of issues you have while still competing really effectively.
I was just reminded of the term allostatic load, chronic stress buildup over time. We have a certain allostatic load, and eventually it can go on for quite some time within toleration, but you have to take time off, or an injury will force you to take time off. And if you're going to have to do it anyway, you should probably choose to take it on your own terms.
At a
A
time
lot
when
less, a lot less invasive that way, for sure.
Yeah, you guys did a really awesome case study on Taylor that you guys put on your IG page. But I think I also wanted to touch on a couple of the other lifters that you're working with. I don't know if we'll have time to get to everybody, but next on my list here is Joe Jordan. I thought Joe had a really highly underrated performance at the 24 World Championships. He first of all, the 66 class itself was very stacked, and it was, the podium competition there was one of the most, well, maybe the most competitive I've ever seen. I guess it's understandable how his performance could have got lost in the shuffle there, but he did really, really well, and he seemed to have a lot left in the tank. Do you agree, or kind of what was your perspective on what was going on there?
I think that we made all the right calls based on our assessment of the second attempt. But he ended up executing his third attempts really well and making it look like he has a lot more. I do
Gotta
think
love
that
that.
he could have squatted more. I do think that he could have benched more. Um, Deadlift was strategic because, of course, if Thailand missed, we would have been going to World Games and you would have been fourth, right? But we're just putting it. It was from fourth to first. So we're putting what we needed on the bar there to try to get the World Games at that point. Joe is a really incredible athlete to work with because I think he has the raw talent where in 2022, he was favored to run away with the 66 class, such as his strength. But issues with execution and showing up consistently have held him back from taking the top step onto the podium. And when Joe started working with Urban and I, he's incredible at the training process. Like, he shows up consistently. He really has his nutrition, his recovery, his focus for each set dialed in, and he's very receptive to coaching. There were certain things that we had to work on to make him perform like a more seasoned competitor. And we also had to string together some successes to put the unreliable performances of the past in the rearview mirror and really have both the coach and athlete believing that Joe is going to make this next third attempt and we're going to go 9 for 9 and we're going to continue building. And so Joe embodies to me that competing isn't a final outcome. It's a process, and each time you take the good and bad from what you did and you learn from it and you try to get better next time out. And yeah, I mean, if you look at our third attempts, he could have lifted more, but based on where his confidence was at, based on his patterns where he may fail a lift, and based on how his second attempts moved, I completely stand behind the calls that we made that day.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, my intention is definitely not so much second guessing, but just, marveling at the potential there. And I know you and I talked about what the preparation had been like. And Joe's case is another one where you guys seem to have drawn a lot of lessons learned from your strength and conditioning background.
Yeah, Joe is because of his movement patterns, his very wide grip bench press and sumo deadlift, he's very susceptible to muscle fatigue in the chest, and his performance will just freaking spiral once that happens. Once he loses pop off the chest and bench press, or once his quads get fatigued, squat and deadlift are going to be shot. And so we had to spread apart the dose across. Actually, Joe performs far better bench pressing 5 days in a row than he does with days of rest in between bench press sessions. So we just had to spread his training apart up across way more days. And in doing that, we were avoiding these maladaptive turns that were happening in like second, third, fourth week of a block. Chest is fatigued, and now he's just getting stapled on bench press. And instead, he has pop off his chest consistently. in 5 months, we were adding like 2.5 kilos per block to his bench press 1RM. And that transferred to competition as well. The second part of that is that he was cutting from like 70 kilos. He doesn't have a lot of room to build more muscles or get leaner. And so the amount of assistance work that we were doing was very, very, very small. And it was just micro dose, the main lead training.
If I remember correctly, you mentioned doing more sets of fewer reps as well. Was that right?
Yeah, we were trying to apply enough training, get him better, because he's not a responder to lower volumes of training. I think we had the dosage right. But to really avoid local muscle fatigue in the chest or quads, because when those two areas went, his performance would spiral fast. And I think that's just a result of his lifting mechanics. But yeah, we were doing our best to reduce intra-session fatigue and also fatigue from one session bleeding into the next.
How were you assessing that, the chest and quad fatigue?
Movement velocity and movement mechanics. So if his chest is fatigued on bench press, he's just grinding out weights that he should crush. And he might, like, the performance downturn is so obvious that you can't say that, like, oh, it's just going to bounce back in a taper, like this is not going well. And so we have to do something. And with his quads, he'll start shifting his entire body back, might start having more hip internal rotation and adduction happening, using his hamstrings and adductors more out of the bottom position. Big downturn in rep speed. And on deadlift, he might not even get, 90% off the floor, which actually happened to us a month out from Worlds too. Again, it's pretty evident when his quads are getting tired.
Your assessment is like these things would happen, and then when you would, apply rest to the chest or the quads, then the problems went away. Over time, you just kind of learned that seems to be what these things are.
It wasn't really rest, because that's another thing. When we deload Joe, his performance would take a major step back. And so we had to really minimize how much we were deloading him by, and basically take on a 5-week block structure where we're going to peak volume early in that block, and then we're going to peak intensity either the week before or the week of the volume deload. And then we're going to build back up to a slightly higher point in the next block and just continue feathering the training load up over time.
Explain this to me a little bit more. You're talking about a 5-week block, and the volume would peak in week 3-ish, and then the intensity would peak in either week 3 or week 4, and then the
Week
tail
4.
end of... Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the tail end of that kind of serves as, like, it's still training, right? Like, it's still a significant amount of training, but it's just less. So you're getting some
less
addition.
volume. And we would use the end of the block to test at a certain load. I don't know, let's say 160. And at the end of the next 5-week blocks, 162.5, 165, just kind of like feathering that up over time. And this consistent approach to just thumping things up a little bit each block really gave his performance a lot of consistency, because when his bench press performance would drop off the face of the earth, rest was not the antidote. He needed a lot of easy reps to start recovering that performance again. Rest would actually further worsen the issue for us, because now we're detraining.
You're battling that skill decay with fatigue, and too much time away from the skill decay. If you're trying to recover from fatigue, you're just tanking both aspects, where your fatigue's high, low skill, then you're not getting practice at the skill, lower performance. And so it makes sense to peak volume and then bring it down for intensity, because if you have someone who responds to a minimum dose of volume but can only sustain it for a little bit. You need to balance out that recovery and skill decay over a block instead of just over a week.
Yeah, fortunately, we were able to figure this out after not having a good second meet with Joe at USVI Nationals. And leading into Worlds, we ended up putting it together and having a good performance and learning a lot of lessons on how he needs to train moving forward too.
That's a tricky thing to suss out because you'd probably have a very good performance somewhere in the middle of a typical block, and then it would just go away. And you'd almost trying to be chasing where in the block did you have your good performance and how can I taper training around that? Because consistent, his consistent results seem to come from a very variable training cycle, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, on squat, it would be that way, but on bench press for our first prep, none of it was good. It was consistently bad until we intervened. Yeah, I was trying everything I could, but it wasn't until we went to high frequency that we started making sustainable progress again.
That's interesting. Do you, like, how much are we talking about here? Like, when you guys, you peak your volume in week 3, which I assume is whatever you're considering to be maximum recoverable at his given level of conditioning, then where do you go from there? Like, how much are you dropping off in the last half of that training block?
Measurable boundary for how much we want to increase volume by depends what phase he's in. If we're peaking for competition, we may do the highest volume of the phase, but it's not an overall progression of volume. When we're looking to progress volume, so we're in a non-competitive period, we might just try to bump up like 5% or 2.5% more than what we did in the previous phase. Very gradual changes over time. And then the amount of volume that we reduce is to stay within or above the 0.8 acute chronic workload ratio using the exponentially weighted moving average equation. And that seemed to be a really firm guideline where Joe would deload and not feel detrained from deloading. So we just stuck onto that.
80%. That's interesting. So forgive me for taking us on a tangent that'll probably not make sense to very many people, but can't help it. 80% seems to be kind of where I've settled as well. I mean, I'm using some different metrics than you, but it's still a similar acute to chronic work ratio formula. What I'm looking at is, I'm not sure how much you're familiar with this. When I'm looking at training stress, and I'll break that down into peripheral and central, which is kind of like how many hard sets are we doing, and then what's the central component is more derived from intensity. The peripheral component is more derived from like an effective reps kind of model, right? But I'm looking at these things separately, and if I'm going to try to increase my intensity from one block to the next, to put it in terms of stress, you're going to increase the amount of central stress that you're given to the athlete. Then you have to decrease the amount of peripheral stress so that they can recover from it, right? Like, this is typical for how intensity changes work. It's just different terminology. But that terminology allows me to look at it through this lens of acute to chronic. And it's interesting that you say 80% for this mechanism that you're looking at, which is more of like a skill retention sort of thing. But that's kind of where I've settled as well, that it lets me maintain an ability while progressing the other ability. That seems to be like a good maintenance sort of level. It's not deloading. It's not like, there's ample recovery resources and I'm just kind of healing up right now. It's not that, but it's just kind of like just holding on to this one kind of adaptive quality while we shift resources to something else.
Yeah, often 80% of what you did peak of a phase ends up being like 1 or 2 less reps per set. Keep that the same, keep the load the same, or maybe peel that back by like 2.5% or something, and you hit that guideline. So as you said, it's still a week of training. It's just an easier week of training. And to produce a predictable performance peak, we'll often have a period of recovery before we do our test to see how you perform when you're in a recovered state. So we'll just do it at the end of that deload. I think it was very frustrating for both of us when his bench press was just downward spiraling. And it's like, it's very atypical response, as you said. But now that we've gotten it figured out, learn some new things from it and move forward, right?
New tool in the toolbox.
Yes, I wanted to also bring up Celine Crum. She's another lifter that you guys have helped considerably. I'm not sure actually how long you've been working with Celine, but I know that for the SBD Raleigh competition, if I'm remembering correctly, she also moved up a weight class. And I would imagine that that move for her looks quite a bit different than it did for Taylor Atwood. She's just at a completely different part of her powerlifting career.
Yeah. So Celine is in her mid-20s. I've been fortunate to coach her since 2022 after the Arnold. And back then she was a sub 60 kilo lifter. And she competed against Natalie Richards at USAPL Nationals. And Natalie bombed due to issues with getting her shoulders back at lockout. So Celine won. And it was at that moment that we realized that Celine might be able to win the USAPL Pro Series, the first one. And so we bumped her up to 63 kilos, and she added like 20 kilos to her total right there. And then we ended up making pretty marginal gain over the next 1.5 years, really, at 63. And I had this feeling Celine was still growing, and she was having to cut more and more to make 63. And it wasn't that it was a huge, I didn't see that her cut was a huge problem to her. But I think she has two exceptional abilities. One is to perceive her own abilities and make attempts. She goes 9 for 9, like, you know, if I had to bet on who's going to go 9 for 9, I'm going to bet her, you know. And the second one is the rate at which she gains muscle. Aside from Taylor going up to 83, I don't think I've seen that before in an athlete. And I've worked with world-class natural bodybuilders too. Like, she just like is a sponge to building muscle. And I just thought, like, going into Powerlifting American Nationals last year, we were going to win. We knew that Meg would have to have some adversity, maybe miss a lift, but we expected to be over 540. And training had indicated that, and it was super deflating what had happened. And after that, I said to Celine, I brought up the idea to say I did again. I brought it up maybe 4 months before Nationals. Maybe we should move up and try to take a run at the 69 class instead. And she didn't want to do that. She wanted to compete against Meg and give it a run at 63. And after this performance, it was super confusing trying to figure out where we went wrong, because usually if a weight cut is what's taking away an athlete's strength, you'd expect bench press to suffer. Her bench press was on fire that day. It was really squat that suffered. And then I think by the time deadlift came around, she was just mentally in a different place to give an all-out effort, just due to the way that the meet had transpired. And I was kind of just betting on the rate of muscle growth that she had, that this would continue if she went up another 6 kilos. So going in SB Raleigh, it was only like 3 to 4 months of eating and trying to grow into that class. She competed as a light 69, and she realized a lot of the progress that we thought was there at 63. So I guess the lesson of that situation was that when you have an athlete who's just soaking up the training and building muscle at such a fast rate, perhaps not blunting that development and encouraging her to go up was the best way all along.
Especially, it's just easier when you're younger, 25, instead of banking on when you're older, being able to put on as much muscle mass, capitalizing on the time when you can really prioritize lifting, training, eating a certain way.
It's surprising that these weight class increases they're moving at a pace that's faster than I would have guessed. Because in this case, you're talking about, a couple months. Even in Taylor's case, being, 6 or 8 months, I'm actually not sure if he filled out 83 or not, but
He has.
oh, okay. Well, that makes a lot more sense then. 6 or 8 months to like partially that clicks for me. A 2 or 3 month increase in weight is not a lot of time.
But for them and the amount of muscle that they've gained in that time, I think that it is very significant. And I don't attribute the progress that Celine made at Raleigh solely to weight gain. I think there were some technique things that we had to tidy up, and also some training things that we could have done better. And it was a summation of all of those lessons we learned at Powerlifting American Nationals.
Yeah. That was another interesting wrinkle to this. If I'm correct, you guys increased the amount of time spent at higher intensities, correct? Increased the number of high intensity reps.
Yeah, Celine tends to prefer a movement strategy where she shifts her entire body back out of the bottom position on squat. And by doing that, she's using a lot of hamstrings and adductors and then glutes and back extension to finish the rep. But I think Celine also has incredibly strong quadriceps. This is just the movement strategy that she uses due to how she's built. And what we saw happening in the final weeks before Powerlifting American Nationals is she started descending faster in squat. And she started struggling with some lateral shifting in the final sessions before the meet. And then if you watch her third attempt at Powerlifting American Nationals, her entire body just kind of took off. I think it was towards the left out of the hole. This showed us that there was maybe some sort of niggle, maybe some coordinative issues that arose, but she needed to get used to lifting more heavy loads and build a more repeatable pattern again. And so for 8 weeks, we trained with really high intensities. And I think she just got better at aligning the forces again and kind of staying stable throughout the movement. And I think that really paid off for her as well.
It's the same with Taylor, where you have the different movement solution strategy at different loads, and you need to make sure at that 1 rep max, that movement solution strategy is one the body's ready to, accustomed to, and trained for in coordination.
That's interesting. You said that she prefers movement strategy where she shifts back out of the hole. Can you say more about that? Like, how did you get to that conclusion?
Yeah. So I would consider something to be a movement strategy when they're doing that regardless of load, and it's consistent. It's movement randomness when you have no idea what's going to happen. And then you could consider it a compensation due to load when maybe the athlete lifts a certain way up until 85%, and then they start gradually lifting in a different way, approaching the 1RM. Celine just squats that way. I think part of it is how she's built. I think part of it is wearing heel. I think it's very effective for her. I don't think she needs to change it. But whenever we watch her from the side, she would just do that from like 125 on. And when she shifts towards her heels, it's loading up her hips and back extensors more. And as I learned from my mentor in biomechanics, Megan Bryanton, you can't just transfer energy magically from your knees to your hips and back. It has to transfer through something. And so Celine is transferring these loading demands through her hamstrings, away from the knees, through her hamstrings, onto her glutes and back extensors. And so just working with Megan really helped me to get a better read on Celine's technique. And then watching her carefully week by week, how she's moving, also just helps to tell the story more over time.
That's interesting. When it comes to the increase in intensity that you guys did, was that just kind of like extending the period of training that's done at high intensity a little bit, or did it peak higher than usual?
It was just doing more singles between 90 and 95%. Instead of running one block with that, we did two. And yeah, it just gave her a ton of practice with that.
I mean, it's interesting to me. Like, this is something that I harp on quite a bit, is that, once you're at the level of being like a trained athlete, like you know how to squat, right? And you're perhaps having some of those compensation patterns that we were talking about, or the technical deviations are kind of load dependent. You have to practice the technique. Like, it's got to present a technical challenge, right? It's not like, oh, just do more reps at 70%. That's if that's not challenging, then that's probably not going to give you the adaptation that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think building muscle was definitely not a problem we had, but if you watch at nationals, Celine had a very wide stance. She was, as the weight got heavier, we're starting to go towards the left instead of centering and going up. And then also she would have shakes in her knee on the way down, and she was going faster on the way down. And if you watch her Raleigh, there were no shakes. She's very centered, and it just looked like a much more coordinated, well-practiced movement. So I think what got her to that level of strength was a lot of muscle growth, but what helped her to realize it was extended periods of high-intensity training that we didn't do before PA Nats.
Right on. With the number of lifters that you're coaching, I expect that you could spend most of your time traveling from place to place coaching all year long if you wanted to. What events are you most looking forward to attending this year?
I look forward to going to Worlds, but Worlds will be exciting no matter what, because we have clients outside of the US, but PA Nationals is a really exciting opportunity for Jessica Espinal, Celine Crum, Taylor Atwood to punch straight tickets to Worlds. So I'm really excited for that one, and it's going to be a really competitive competition.
Yeah, that'll be a fun one, especially like bringing a big group like that to a competition like PA Nationals, where everyone, well, I guess I'd just say it just pays to be at peak performance for a competition like that one. Yeah. That'll be fun. I'm hoping to be there as well. I'd like to watch all of that stuff from
Awesome. Yeah.
from the front row. Jason, man, thank you very much for being here, for answering 1,000 questions about all these athletes. Always good to compare notes with you.
Well, thank you both for having me, and it was an interesting conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks everyone for watching and listening, and we'll see you all next time. Shh. There is a secret to great training programs, but it's not a magic set and rep scheme or this one weird exercise that powerlifting pros don't want you to know about. The secret is in your training log. See, years ago, we began developing tools to help you unlock these secrets, and we've been putting them online for free ever since. That's right, it's free for everybody. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? People have been logging training forever, and you're right, but the secret isn't just in keeping a logbook. It's using that log to make better training decisions. That's the real secret. This is where the RTS training log excels. You haven't done SSB squats in 3 months and you're wondering what your target weight should be? We can help you with that. Did you overshoot on your top set and you're wondering if you should adjust your back off sets? We can help you with that too. Are you building the most important training block of this year and you're wondering what your most highly effective blocks have in common? Yep, we got you covered there too. There's more. There's a lot more. And yes, it is all free. Not just a free trial, not free with ads, just regular free. You go to reactivetrainingsystems.com, then you click on apps, sign up for a login, and you're in.